Turning to Canada's trade war with the U.S. now, the issue putting a spotlight on a remote part in northern Manitoba. A remote port, that is, in northern Manitoba. The port of Churchill could soon be a very strategic asset.
Trump demands control of Canadian ports. Not oil, not lumber. Ports. Vancouver, Prince Rupert, Halifax, the arteries of Canada's trade lifeblood. His justification? America's supply chains can't depend on foreign docks. In one stroke, Trump reignited a century-old rivalry, one that Mark Carney, Canada's Prime Minister, wasn't about to bow to. When Carney fired back with his now viral statement, "Canada is not for sale,"
It's not for sale, won't be for sale.
Washington froze. Trade corridors halted, U.S. importers panicked. And what started as a logistics partnership turned into an all-out sovereignty showdown. Because beneath the headlines wasn't just trade policy, it was humiliation. The kind that shakes markets and fractures alliances. And as the dust settles, one question remains. Is Trump rebuilding American strength or isolating it? Like, subscribe and keep watching. This one's just getting started. When Trump made that demand, full or partial strategic oversight of Canadian ports, even his own advisors flinched. The statement dropped like a bomb during a White House press briefing in early 2025. His reasoning was blunt. If our goods depend on Canadian docks, we don't control our own trade. What he was really saying was that American dominance stops at the border, and he's not okay with that. Behind the curtain, Washington insiders revealed that Trump's real frustration began with shipping delays and new inspection fees at British Columbia ports. Those fees, introduced under Carney's administration, were part of a Canadian initiative to increase domestic revenue from U.S. traffic, an estimated $12 billion a year flowing through Canadian ports. For Trump, it was another example of Canada profiting off American dependence. Within days, the administration hinted at retaliatory measures, tariffs on autos, grain, even pharmaceuticals. Then came the second wave. U.S. trade envoys demanding shared governance over ports handling American goods. In short, a polite-sounding term for partial control. Ottawa's response was immediate and scathing. Canada's ports are not extensions of the United States, Carney said, calling the move a direct challenge to sovereignty. His defiance electrified Parliament, uniting opposition parties, labor unions, and even conservative premiers who normally criticize him. That unity, however, masked deep anxiety. Canada's West Coast ports handle over 70% of trans-Pacific US-bound cargo, from electronics to auto parts. Any disruption risks billions in trade. But Carney saw the bigger picture. Giving in now would set a dangerous precedent, one where American policy could dictate Canadian infrastructure. First its ports, one insider warned. Next its pipelines, railways, and water. The timing couldn't be worse for the U.S. economy. Trump's aggressive tariff strategy had already rattled global supply chains. Inflation was creeping back. Manufacturing hubs like Michigan and Illinois were struggling with rising shipping costs as West Coast bottlenecks grew. Yet Trump's message resonated with his base. Take back control of America's trade routes, even if it means forcing allies to bend. What Carney didn't expect was how quickly the rhetoric would escalate. Within 48 hours, Trump's advisors began floating the idea of American designated terminals, fenced-off sections in Canadian ports managed jointly by U.S. Customs. Think of it as a mini-sovereign zone under American oversight. For Canada, that was the last straw. The Foreign Affairs Ministry called it an invasion in slow motion. Protests erupted across Vancouver and Halifax, with dock workers carrying signs reading, "Not 1 inch." Indigenous coalitions, too, weighed in, particularly from coastal territories that see port control as tied to land rights and resource governance. Our sovereignty isn't negotiable, one First Nations leader told CBC, not for trade, not for profit. By midweek, Carney took the fight to international media, accusing Trump of economic imperialism. His tone was measured but firm. Canada has always been a partner, not a property. The comment drew applause across Europe and Asia, regions already uneasy about Trump's America First, last and always doctrine. Markets reacted instantly. The Toronto Stock Exchange dipped 4% in 2 days, while American logistics firms warned of massive disruptions if negotiations failed. Wall Street analysts called it the most severe cross-border tension since the 1980s, softwood lumber wars. And yet, Trump's administration didn't back down. Behind the theatrics, they saw leverage. Canada exports 75% of its goods to the United States, a vulnerability too big to ignore. By targeting ports, Washington was pressuring Ottawa where it hurts most, its economic arteries. As diplomatic talks froze, speculation surged. Would the U.S. impose maritime tariffs next? Would Canada restrict access to its Pacific and Atlantic gateways? Some analysts whispered of a cold trade war, a replay of past economic standoffs. But this time fought not over oil or steel, but over who controls the gates of global commerce. Carney doubled down, forming an emergency coalition of 8 provincial leaders and more than 50 trade unions under the banner, "Hands off our ports." It wasn't just nationalism, it was political survival. In a country still reeling from lumber cuts, refinery closures, and inflationary pressures, defending ports became a unifying symbol. The line Canada refused to cross. But even unity comes at a price. Supply chain delays worsened. American agricultural imports faced days-long backlogs at Prince Rupert. The trucking industry warned of shortages in everything from produce to automotive parts. And as both sides dug in, one thing became clear. This wasn't just a trade dispute anymore. It was a test of who truly held power in North America, the White House or Ottawa. And while Carney was drawing his red line, Trump was already planning his next move, one that would weaponize U.S. droughts and industrial shortages to force Canada's hand. Because when ports became off-limits, water became the next bargaining chip. Trump's next move came quietly, but it hit like a political earthquake. As Carney stood firm on ports, Washington shifted the battleground to water. Trump linked the port standoff to America's deepening drought crisis, declaring that Canada controls the tap that feeds our industries. Within hours, the Columbia River and Great Lakes, once seen as symbols of cooperation, were recast as instruments of leverage. His advisors began framing access to Canadian water as a continental right, citing America's investments in North American infrastructure since the 1960s. It was a diplomatic grenade wrapped in legal jargon. Behind closed doors, Trump's administration tied water access to port negotiations. You want free trade? Then open the ports and the rivers, leaked documents revealed. Carney refused again, stating, "Canada will not trade sovereignty for convenience." The quote dominated global headlines. Environmental groups, indigenous nations, and even European allies rallied behind him, calling it a defining moment for modern sovereignty. But for the United States, facing its worst drought in 40 years, it was seen as betrayal. By spring, the consequences were everywhere. California, which produces 40% of America's vegetables and 2/3 of its fruits and nuts, was withering. Reservoirs hit record lows, forcing farmers to abandon fields. Prices spiked, eggs at $5 a dozen, milk up 20%, and lettuce shortages across major supermarkets. Semiconductor plants in Arizona and Texas, using nearly 10 million gallons of water a week, began slowing output. Each gallon mattered, and Canada's refusal made Washington furious. Then came the industrial backlash. Midwest steel and auto manufacturers, reliant on cooling water supplies and steady logistics, faced rolling shutdowns. Power plants in coal-heavy states like Indiana and Ohio reported higher operational costs due to limited water flow and surging energy prices. To the average American worker, it wasn't a diplomatic standoff. It was their paycheck. Trump seized that anger, turning it into political fuel. His rallies became theatrical condemnations of Carney's leadership. "Canada's choking America's economy," he thundered before thousands in Michigan. The crowd roared. "We built their prosperity. Now they shut our ports, block our rivers, and call it partnership." His campaign released dramatic ads showing empty canals, drought-scorched farms, and idle factory belts. The message was clear: America's suffering was Canada's doing. But the global stage told a different story. As the U.S. tried to pressure Ottawa, other nations saw opportunity. China began probing Canadian water investments, hinting at long-term deals for agricultural use and reservoir infrastructure. Europe, reeling from back-to-back summer droughts, floated proposals to import Canadian desalination technology. And Asia, particularly India and Singapore, began courting Canada for agricultural partnerships. Suddenly, Carney wasn't isolated. He was in demand. International media reframed the situation. "Canada, the gatekeeper of blue gold," read a headline from The Guardian. Analysts compared the moment to the 1970s oil embargo, when control of a resource redrew global power lines. Only this time, the commodity wasn't black, it was blue. Water had become the new currency of power. As global attention shifted, financial markets responded. Investment funds began labeling water security as the next frontier in resource competition. Canadian blue-chip stocks in utilities and hydropower soared. Yet Carney's gamble seemed deliberate. He was betting that the era of U.S. leverage was ending, that control over natural resources, not military or financial clout, would define the next generation of power. By late 2025, it was undeniable. The trade war had evolved into a resource war. America's droughts deepened, ports stood politically frozen, and the Columbia River Treaty renewal remained suspended. Analysts called it a tectonic shift in North American relations, but beneath the headlines, a new narrative was taking shape. For the first time in decades, Canada wasn't just defending itself, it was dictating the terms. And as Washington scrambled to contain the fallout, Trump's gamble began to look like overreach. The man who promised to reclaim American control had triggered a crisis that left U.S. trade humiliated and Canada standing taller than ever. So here we are, a continent divided not by ideology or borders, but by water and pride. Trump's gamble to control Canadian ports was meant to restore American dominance. Instead, it exposed just how fragile that dominance has become. Carney's defiance turned what should have been another trade negotiation into a full-scale geopolitical chess match, one where Canada, for once, didn't blink. The result? America's trade routes strained, its industries gasping, and its once reliable northern ally suddenly holding all the cards. The irony is brutal. A world where droughts replace oil shortages and nations fight not for energy, but for survival itself. If you found this story eye-opening, make sure to like, subscribe, and keep watching. Because what's unfolding next, from drought diplomacy to the rise of water wars, could redefine global power forever.